acceptance, a decorated war hero and American celebrity.
Audie Murphy Day, recognizing one of the most decorated soldiers of World War II.
The Audie Murphy mystery has just been solved, and it is worse than we thought, not because it rewrites his heroism, but because it forces us to stare at the machinery that surrounded it. I am not treating this as a verified, real-world breaking news claim here, but as a grounded, realistic exploration of what it would mean if a long-whispered question about Murphy's life or death suddenly snapped into focus with hard evidence. That kind of headline doesn't land unless it touches something people already feel in their bones. That Murphy, America's most decorated U.S. soldier of World War II and later a movie star, lived inside a legend that was both a tribute and a trap. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Any mystery attached to Murphy is inevitably pulled into two gravitational fields. One is the public myth of the perfect war hero, the clean arc from battlefield to big screen, the reassuring idea that courage seals off suffering. The other is the private reality of a man who carried combat long after combat ended, who dealt with what we would now call severe PTSD, and who spent years navigating insomnia, anxiety, anger, and the strange loneliness of being celebrated for experiences that also haunted him. A solution to any major mystery in that space, if it arrives now, would not simply be a clue in a case file. It would be an indictment of how a country packages trauma into inspiration. The most plausible arena for a modern, headline-sized revelation is the tension between Murphy's public symbolism and the systems that benefited from it. If a cache of documents, recordings, or testimony surfaced today, it might not claim that the hero was a fraud. That would be too simple, too tabloid, and too easy to debunk through the historical record of his service. The darker and more believable version is institutional convenience, the subtle but brutal ways the truth can be shaped without outright lying. The worst revelations are often not about invented events, but about selective silence, missing context, and decisions made in meeting rooms where human lives are reduced to optics. Picture the event that explodes this story into the open: a newly cataloged set of military, medical, or legal records discovered in an archive review, a family estate Zhengli, or a long-delayed declassification process. The immediate shock is less about a single smoking gun and more about a pattern. The records suggest that the people who manage Murphy's image, whether in government, media, or entertainment, knew more about the severity of his suffering than the public ever did. They did not merely fail to help, they weighed the costs of help against the value of the symbol. That is where worse than we thought begins to take shape. We often assume historical cruelty requires monstrous intent, but real-world harm is frequently bureaucratic. In this scenario, the evidence indicates that Murphy's mental and physical struggles were understood by officials and executives who considered him strategically important. The decision was not necessarily to ruin him, it was to keep him functional enough to perform the role of Audie Murphy in the national imagination. The hero had become a resource, and resources get managed. This would land hardest because Murphy's authenticity is not in question. His bravery was real. His battlefield record was real. His willingness to speak, even in a limited way for his era, about the psychological costs of war was real. If the mystery resolved in a way that reveals he was knowingly left to bear an impossible burden to preserve a narrative, it reframes his pain as partially manufactured by neglect. That does not reduce his greatness. It magnifies the price he paid on behalf of a public that wanted the triumph without the tremor in the voice. The implications would extend beyond one man's biography. It would force a new look at the post-war culture that sealed psychological injury behind a grin for the camera. Murphy was not the only veteran swallowing nightmares in silence. He was just the most visible. A revelation of institutional awareness would suggest that the silence was not only cultural, but also structured. It would imply that systems tasked with supporting service members instead prioritized a message of invulnerability, because invulnerability sells wars as clean and survivable. There is also the entertainment dimension, which carries its own moral weight. Murphy's transition into film gave him a unique form of power and a unique vulnerability. The screen offers a second life, but it can also lock a person into a single version of themselves. If newly revealed evidence suggested that studios, publicists, or other gatekeepers encouraged him to reenact a heroic identity while privately dismissing or minimizing his trauma, that is a particular kind of cruelty. It turns performance into compression, squeezing a living person into a marketable silhouette. A solution to the mystery could also illuminate how medications and coping strategies were treated in that era. Veterans were often pushed toward quick stabilization rather than holistic care, particularly in a time when PTSD was not yet formally recognized. If new records showed repeated warnings about the risks of untreated trauma or about reliance on sedatives without adequate therapy and support, the revelation would not be sensational in a cinematic way. It would be worse in a slow, suffocating way. It would show that the harm was foreseeable and still allowed to continue. This matters because public memory likes a tidy narrative. We love the image of Murphy as the man who overcame war and became a star. But that narrative can inadvertently shame other veterans who do not or cannot make that leap. It suggests that grit alone is enough. A darker resolution to a Murphy-related mystery would call that assumption out as a comforting myth. It would remind us that resilience is not a personal trait floating in a vacuum. It is heavily shaped by environment, support, medical knowledge, and social permission to admit vulnerability. There's another angle that could make such a revelation feel uniquely grim: the possibility of suppressed testimony. If a newly surfaced account from a peer, clinician, or collaborator described repeated pleas from Murphy for more help, more rest, or more honesty about what combat did to him, the story becomes less about a misunderstood hero and more about a warning bell ignored. The emotional punch is not in the fact of suffering, which many already acknowledge, but in the idea that he tried to change the script and was gently but firmly steered back into the role that America preferred. The broader implications for military policy and veteran care would be immediate in our present-day conversation. Today's public is far more familiar with discussions of trauma, moral injury, and the need for comprehensive support. A dramatic historical revelation involving a figure as iconic as Murphy would become a landmark example in debates over how nations treat service members after the cameras stop rolling. It would sharpen arguments that honoring veterans is not primarily about ceremonies or slogans. It is about long-term funding, early intervention, and the cultural courage to let heroes be human. It would also complicate the way we teach heroism. The best version of heroism is not a statue that never cracks. It is bravery that coexists with fear, compassion that survives violence, and leadership that refuses to pretend pain is weakness. If the mystery solution showed that Murphy was quietly carrying a weight that institutions preferred not to name, then the lesson becomes richer and more uncomfortable. It suggests that a society can revere courage while simultaneously exploiting the courageous, not out of malice always, but out of hunger for legacy. This kind of revelation would also ask us to rethink the ethics of biography and commemoration. When we tell the story of someone like Murphy, we often emphasize the extraordinary moments because they inspire. But inspiration can become extraction. It can take a man's worst days and turn them into an inspirational poster. A corrected or expanded account, driven by newly surfaced evidence, would push historians, filmmakers, and the public to handle such stories with more care. The goal would not be to dim the light of his achievements, but to stop using that light to blind ourselves to costs we still impose on veterans now. The cultural implications could ripple into how we view wartime storytelling itself. Societies often need symbols during conflict and afterward. The danger is that symbols can become too valuable to admit complexity. If Murphy's mystery was solved in a way that revealed deliberate narrative management, it would highlight a recurring pattern across eras. The public is offered a simplified hero because complexity might raise awkward questions about policy, training, deployment cycles, or the true human cost of war. Even the phrase "worse than we thought" carries a specific meaning in this context. It does not have to imply a conspiracy with a theatrical villain. It can mean something more chilling, that the people with authority were ordinary, pragmatic, and willing to accept collateral damage as long as the national story stayed intact. That kind of moral failure is harder to purge because it lives in incentives, not just in individual wrongdoing. It teaches us to be skeptical of narratives that are too perfectly polished, especially when the subject is someone whose life bridged war, politics, and entertainment. If we keep the focus on the event of the mystery being solved and what that solution implies, the heart of the matter is this. Murphy's life becomes an intense case study in how a nation can love a person as an idea while failing to protect them as a human being. The revelation would not rescue him from history. It would rescue our understanding of him from caricature. It would tell us that the most decorated hero was still vulnerable to the quiet violence of neglect and expectation. What makes a revelation like this so destabilizing is how it forces a distinction between legend and evidence without letting either side win cleanly. The event of the mystery being solved would likely arrive not as a single dramatic disclosure, but as an incremental assembly of proof that finally reaches critical mass. That model of revelation matters because it changes how the public assigns blame. A solitary explosive confession can be dismissed as an anomaly or a personal grievance. A layered record of memos, medical notes, correspondence, and contemporaneous accounts implies system behavior. It suggests that the truth was never fully absent. It was distributed, compartmentalized, and rendered harmless by being kept separate. In that light, the meaning of solved is less about satisfying curiosity and more about clarifying accountability. The enduring fascination with Murphy has always mixed admiration with unease. A confirmed answer to a contested question in his story would crystallize that unease into something concrete. A demonstration of how easily a society can confuse public gratitude with private obligation. Gratitude without obligation becomes performance. Obligation without performance would have required resources, policy changes, and the willingness to admit that the most inspiring narratives are also the most fragile. The event would also highlight how language shapes what a nation is capable of seeing. Mid-century America had fewer accepted terms for invisible wounds. If the new evidence showed that professionals grasped the seriousness of what Murphy endured but lacked socially acceptable frameworks to address it publicly, that would implicate not only institutions but the culture that constrained them. It would confirm that denial can be collective without being coordinated. People might have noticed the signs but lacked a shared vocabulary to dignify them, and that absence of language gives moral cover to inaction. Another implication is the ethics of representation, when a living, breathing veteran becomes a template for others. Murphy was not just a man, he was used as a measuring stick. His public image quietly told other veterans what they were supposed to be able to do with their own pain. If the solved mystery reveals that he was struggling more severely or more consistently than the public believed, then the measuring stick itself becomes suspect. The moral harm of that kind of symbolic overuse is not abstract. It creates a culture where people conceal suffering to avoid disappointing an imagined standard. The event would also expose how fragile truth becomes when it must compete with an economically valuable story. The post-war entertainment ecosystem thrived on narratives that soothed a war-weary public. If the newly uncovered details suggest that stakeholders shaped what could be said about Murphy's condition, behavior, or needs, then the revelation becomes a case study in the political economy of memory. It implies that the marketplace of stories did not just amplify heroism, it curated which parts of heroism were allowed to be seen. This has implications for how we interpret other iconic figures whose lives straddle military history and popular culture. Murphy's status makes him a keystone in the arch of 20th century American hero-making. When a keystone shifts, even slightly, the entire arc looks different. A clarified truth about his experience would nudge historians to re-examine the assumptions surrounding similar transitions from battlefield to celebrity. The public often treats these trajectories as proof that war can be domesticated into entertainment without residue. A darker, more documented understanding would show the residue was always there, even if it was edited out of the frame. The event would also sharpen debate around what counts as patriotic storytelling. Many people equate critique of institutional handling of heroes with disrespect for service, but a solved mystery that reveals neglect or calculated image management challenges that reflex. It suggests that real respect requires truthfulness about cost. In this sense, the story would not be anti-hero, it would be anti-sanitization. The implication is that patriotism is not a refusal to look at harm. It is a commitment to reduce it. There is a deeply human layer to this as well, the boundary between privacy and public interest. A figure like Murphy occupies an unusual space where his private suffering was always adjacent to public ownership of his image. If the mystery's resolution hinged on personal, medical, or psychological records, the event would raise hard questions about how much the public is entitled to know. The implication would be that the hunger for clarity must be matched by a restraint that honors personhood. The public benefit of truth is real, but so is the danger of turning a man's most vulnerable details into a spectacle. A responsible engagement with the solved mystery would have to balance both. The nature of evidence itself would spark broader conversations about historical credibility. In modern culture, we often treat archival discoveries as inherently authoritative. But records are produced by people with agendas, fears, and blind spots. If the solution emerged from files that had been misfiled, sealed, or ignored for decades, it would remind us that the archive is not a neutral vault. It is a reflection of power. The implication is that what we know about heroes, wars, and nations is shaped as much by what was preserved as by what was allowed to vanish. This particular kind of revelation would also underscore the difference between individual suffering and structural risk. The public might instinctively read the story as a tragedy unique to Murphy's psychology or personality. But if the evidence points to predictable pressures placed on high-profile veterans, then the event becomes an argument that the risk was architectural. When institutions elevate a single person into a symbol, they substitute singularity for policy. They reassure themselves that one shining example can stand in for thousands of complex outcomes. The implication is that symbol-based thinking can distort priorities and delay reforms. A solved mystery could further deepen our understanding of moral injury, the pain that comes not only from fear and violence, but from betrayal, ambiguity, or the collapse of meaning. If new materials suggested that Murphy's struggles were intertwined with disillusionment, guilt, or anger at how war was being explained to civilians, this would widen the lens through which his legacy is viewed. The implication is that trauma is not only a medical issue, it is also an ethical and social one, living at the intersection of personal conscience and national narrative. The public response to this event, even without describing a long aftermath, would be shaped by a modern appetite for complexity. Contemporary audiences are more prepared to accept that heroism and suffering are not opposites. The revelation would likely be absorbed into a broader cultural movement that tries to humanize historical icons without treating them as hollow brands. The implication is that Murphy's story could become a bridge between older myths of stoicism and newer models of emotional truth. This would also influence how educational systems frame military history. If the mystery's resolution becomes part of mainstream understanding, teachers and curriculum designers would have a more nuanced example to illustrate the psychological and societal costs of war. The implication here is subtle but powerful. Young people could learn that bravery is not negated by vulnerability, and that the price of war is not only measured in casualties and geopolitics, but also in long-term human consequence. There is an additional implication for media ethics. A solved mystery that reveals earlier minimization or selective framing would complicate the role of journalists and biographers who helped sustain a simplified image. The public might be tempted to assign retroactive villainy to individuals who were also products of their era's norms. The more useful implication is that media ecosystems can become complicit in harm even when they believe they are honoring someone. The line between tribute and exploitation is thin when the subject's pain is inconvenient to the story being sold. The event would also be a lesson in how societies metabolize war through narrative cycles. After major conflicts, the first wave of storytelling often emphasizes unity and courage. Later waves introduce disillusionment and critique. A dramatic clarifying discovery in Murphy's case would accelerate that second-wave understanding of World War II's human cost. The implication is not that the war's moral stakes were false, but that the emotional costs were underestimated and the institutional responsibilities afterward were too lightly defined. Another angle lies in the way masculinity has historically been policed through public archetypes. Murphy's image, like that of many wartime heroes, reinforced a specific vision of male endurance. If the solved mystery reveals deeper internal struggle that was known yet not fully acknowledged, it becomes evidence of how rigid masculinity can function as a public health problem. The implication is that culture can injure people by limiting the acceptable ways they are allowed to hurt. This is why the emotional force of the revelation would not depend on scandal. It would depend on recognition. It would show the gap between what a nation wants its heroes to represent and what real human biology and psychology permit. It would argue implicitly that the most dangerous myths are not the ones that invent heroism, but the ones that deny the maintenance required to sustain the people we turn into icons. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the Audie Murphy mystery finally being solved? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.